Hello, hello. Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone at SALT. I'm really honored to be here, and I wish I could be with you in person. My title is actually When Our Art is in Our Hands, and this is a talk in which I will be performing remains of a conversation that I had with Hannah B. Hurling. And I heard that yesterday was fantastic. I'm sorry I couldn't be here. I hope that what I have to offer will um, build upon that or make a contribution of some kind. I'm looking forward to this day, this full day. I want to start by, my talk is in 5 parts: acknowledgement, conservation, conversation, antiphony, conversation, conservation, and dissensus. Dissensus is very short. And I'll start with acknowledgement. I'm speaking with you today from the unceded territory and ancestral homeland of the Narragansett people. Many Indigenous people live and work in these lands today, now called New England, now called the United States. I am on a place called, quote, College Hill because it supports Brown University, where I am a professor. Here is a picture of my campus. This is a triumphal arch through which I walk. I offer this acknowledgement not only because it is important to acknowledge the genocidal removals and forced labor of Indigenous and African peoples that built the so-called New World from where I speak, but also because wherever we are in the capitalist world, that is, from any country on the globe developed for and through capitalism, colonial capitalism, right? That is the extraction machine of the extraction of planetary resources for the unbalanced and exploitative growth of wealth, wherever we are in that world, we live with the legacies of and are impacted by what Francine Berger has called the racial capitalocene. We are living, as Saidiya Hartman writes, in the afterlives of slavery. So I offer this acknowledgement because my comments about preservation today, preservation and performance art, will be inflected with and by the realities of where I am in the world, again, on Narragansett territory, where a walk to my office does not preserve the culture and life and performance lifeways of the Narragansett, but takes me through this arch and past this statue, Rome, on Narragansett land. Any performance I preserve here or work to preserve here will, for the time being, be in the shadow of this statue. Any comments about the conservation of performance-based art that I make are brought to you by the shadow of this statue and others like it. I say this because we gather here to talk about preservation of performance-based art for history. And I think it is important as we speak of this to acknowledge that preservation has not been the interest of colonial capitalism. The modern globalization of European cultures and ways of knowing, or what Tiffany Lethabo King has termed conquistador subjectivity, has pointedly not preserved whole spectrums of performance forms, worlds of Indigenous ceremonies, rituals, and lifeways. So to come to preservation of performance is, as Diana Taylor has written, very late in the game of Western domination. That is, despite being replete with imperial archives that supposedly save, rather than preserving or conserving, such archives ripped objects from their ritual contexts, indeed put into place a distinction between object and performance that is in some contexts wholly false. Such actions pillaged and placed in archives and treasuries, museums, and private collections, objects that were denuded of performance ways, of performanceship. And I'm interested in the idea of performanceship rather than stewardship. That stripping away of performance was in the name of preservation, but instead it killed not only objects, but the condition for acknowledging the performance bases of all objecthood. 2, conservation. I recently was invited to speak at a conference in Bern, Switzerland. It was May. We gathered from around the world on Zoom, much as we are here. The conference was called Performance, Ethics, and Politics of Care, was part of an ongoing research project that Hannah B. Hurling has organized. What I did for that conference, I was invited to give a keynote, and I invited Hannah Hurling to join me in conversation. This is Hannah. Here we are in conversation on the Zoom. This is Hannah B. Hurling and myself performing our conversation. We had a set of emails for months in advance. This is not the event itself, right? It's a screenshot of the event, and yet it is also here live, I want to argue, with us today. I want you to know what we did. We had a conversation about conservation. And what I am presenting to you now is an afterlife, an ongoing livingness of that conversation. It is an iteration, elaboration, an ongoing side effect, perhaps because performance is that. I'm interested in side effect because perhaps performance is that, rather than forward and backward, even rather than appearing / disappearing / reappearing. Live performance moves to the sides. It jumps bodies. It jumps movements. It jumps moments and movements. It takes place laterally in and as an irresolvable tangle of differences and samenesses. In fact, differences and samenesses come undone or become legible as kind of a boring binary, right? A leftover of empire's empirics. Performance is the leaky, fleshly stuff of the interstice, the betweenness and amongness of persons, things, times, and places. To conserve performance is to conserve not the thing itself, but the conditions for difference and sameness, to procreate, to enter in, animate, to elaborate, migrate, and obfuscate. If we can together conceive of conservation as its self-performance, right, as its self-procreation, then we are gathering, I want to think, perhaps out from under the triumphal arch. We are moving sideways, otherwise and elsewise, to the traditional preservation plantation, the preservation plot. But I'm kind of waxing a little bit like poetic. I'm kind of sidestepping the question. I think throughout my whole talk, I'll be sidestepping the question, but allow me to try to return to the topic. So anyway, Hannah and I engaged in conversation, and perhaps now here I am engaged in conversation conservation, but without Hannah by my side. She's not here, but the conversation is ongoing. She has told me she might be here. I'm not sure. She definitely said that she would watch it later as a recording. So hi, Hannah. You are here, even wherever you're here and whenever it becomes. So for those of you who do not know Hannah, who is not necessarily here, or who is not yet here, right? Here are some images. There's Hannah B. Hurling. This is Hannah performing as a theorist. These are poor substitutes, obviously. They might remind us of the grainy black and white images captured of 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s performance art. These thumbnails of Hannah that I found on the web cannot stand in for Hannah. They capture nothing of our past conversation, or maybe something, but if she is to join us here later, as she has said she might, perhaps these found images of Hannah and the Zoom recording and the screenshot, as well as this Zoom event now, are not only about to be or already documents of the past, but are intimations of always coming lateral leakages, the afterlives and sideways moving of event as conversation, commentary, orature, Baroque adornment, ornamentation, attention, and I think we'll hear from Rebecca Gordon later, elaboration, the ongoing reverberation of this conversation, and so very, very many others. Please feel free to chat in the comments. There we are. 3, antiphony. I want to touch on our conversation, our conservation conversation, because it feels unfinished and ongoing. Indeed, it is unfinished and ongoing. Here is a copy of the transcript as a manuscript in the process of being readied for publication. The invitation from Hannah for a solo became a duo, became a transcript, and it's being translated into French. And it's now here as my performance, whatever it is I'm doing here, right? So what I'm doing, though, is not a redo or a reenactment. I am thinking more of lateral iterations, antiphony. Antiphony moves beside people, kind of like choruses. I'm thinking of choruses and refrains. I'm thinking of gestures of call and response. Call and response, another word for antiphony, perhaps a better word, because of the other histories it drags along with it, especially African diasporic ways of knowing. I'm thinking of call and response become call, become response in an ongoing multiphonal intra-articulation of interstices among performances. Basically, our engagement in the question of the preservation of performance art took place as a conversation between Hannah and myself, because we felt that a conversation, a kind of call and response arena, right, actually formally got at some of the issues concerning cross-temporality, cross-spatiality, and undecidability of the body jump. The preservation of performance art might always have to think about preserving interstices as well as acts. For the interstice defines an object as a performing object. It defines the object as a performance. So what is it to try to preserve the spaces between performance-based iterations? But now here I am talking with you about that conversation, telling it again in a time removed from when it was performed. I am citing it. I am elaborating upon it. I am in effect thinking with it again. But by doing so, I am also thinking again differently. Our performance that took place in May of 2021 has changed as it is now transcripted into a manuscript, and then it will be in French, but it will still be the conversation. So here, right now, in the Zoom portal that is SALT in Istanbul, it is unfolding as, what, question mark. A conversation with you laminated on a conversation with Hannah that was itself the product of so many other conversations, other Zooms, other rooms. And now we are literally 15,000 words into my presentation, and I still have not reproduced or reenacted the conversation that I claim that this is. So let's get going. 4, conversation conservation. What did we say then? Can it be said again now when Hannah is not yet here? All right. So Hannah B. Holing started talking about 2 modes. She talked about the first one, the conservation of performance, thinks performance as a sort of conservation object. And second, the performance of conservation applies the tool of performance studies to the apparatus of conservation. Here's what we talked about then after her prompt, right? What happens to objecthood in relation to 2 different modes of approach? Conservation of performance and performance of conservation. I thought this prompt of hers was interesting, right? And so I quoted her back to herself. I said, sorry. You say that conservation of performance thinks of performance-based works as conservation objects. I said it was interesting to think about performance as object, and I asked in return, must performance be approached as an object in order to be preservable? And so yeah, here was, I think what happened is I missed a slide if I go back. Nope. Okay. Must performance be approached as object in order to be conserved? And then here is what we talked about, the conservation of performance and the performance of conservation. If performance can be approached as an object, I said, what kind of object is it? At this point, I suggested that we think about the wave. So, I hope you can see me. I'm waving at you. You may or may not respond. In case you couldn't see me, I've gone ahead and made an aid for you. So if we think of gesture as an object, such as the wave of a hand to indicate hello, Are we thinking of it as composed of matter? That is, thinking of it as matter that coheres across time. And surely a wave coheres across time. You may have waved back now, or you may not have waved back. But I assure you, if you did not wave back at me now, at some point in the next day, in the next week, in the next month, or maybe the next year, you will come out of your room, you will cross the street, you will wave at someone. This wave, you may have waved last week. I'm interested in the relation of these iterations of performance in a vast kind of reverberation machine. So we could say that this gestural object of the wave, the gesture, is flesh as material, and it coheres or is conserved as that material across time through resurgence, or what Marcel Mauss famously called iterability. By this logic, flesh in and as performance can be considered an object by virtue of the repetition, perhaps the recoherence of its material instantiation in and across time, its capacity for reiteration, which is the same as its capacity for iteration. Which pronounces a kind of endurance we generally have granted to objects in distinction to embodied live actions. But obviously bodies are material, and like other objects, they take place, like other objects in time. Like other objects, they've been rendered fungible and submitted to dehumanization, to commodification. And at the end of this talk, I'm going to put a screen up with a bibliography of thinkers in Black feminist thought and Black radical tradition who think deeply about the body object constellation historically in relation to the flesh trade. So I told Hannah in the conversation, I said, if we look at performance as object, and if we recognize a hand wave, mine or yours, as an object made of flesh that recurs, but does not necessarily congeal into a sovereign body, a sovereign object, in that it jumps across bodies in time, does our gesture begin to share something with other material objects? All objects given to materialization cohere and decay and possibly recohere in different temporal rates. Acknowledging this, can all objects, such as my gesture, but also something like, let's say, the Venus von Willendorf, whose name, like the Narragansett territory I speak from, was renamed for a Roman goddess. Can this be said to engage in the dynamic playfield of the capacity for reiteration, a different type of reiteration than the triumphal arch, a capacity for reiteration, for elaboration, for body jumping, hand to hand to hand, material to fungible material that marks performance? Perhaps what I've been asking is whether all objects to some degree cohere as performance. Aren't all objects of varying materials time-based arts? So Hannah Holing said super smart things, a whole lot of them. And please, I look forward to the publication. But she said then, quote, I would like to think more about the idea of gesture with you. And so our conversation began to unfold about what gesture is and how gesture helps me think through this kind of problem. That gesture is relational, that we think of everything as gestural, right, in a reverberant world, antiphonal, interstitial, interinanimate, partial, right? A gesture is not the thing itself, it moves off of itself into relation. Lateral, gesture is often thought of as accompaniment and not the thing itself. Open to response, that is, it bears responsibility, and it assumes a reverberant world. So gesture is helpful for me, and we can unpack any of these things if we had more time. And so Hannah said, yes, to think about gesture is to imagine it being passed through flesh and repetition, and to understand its capacity to be reiterated as something always already citing, drawing from the, I'm sorry, I can't see on my screen now because I'm afraid to put this back, drawing from the past as always essentially reemergent, but also opening out towards something coming. However, does this reemergence qualify as a form of conservation? So Hannah was fantastic at really getting to the point of the question. Okay, so Hannah said, So then we shifted to the side, and instead of continuing to talk about the object of conservation, we began to talk about the performance of conservation. Performance of conservation. Based on many important insights by Hannah, I then said, the degree to which we think of artworks as objects that undergo transformation and as objects with many different pasts requires us to abandon, which was Hannah's word, the search for authenticity as existing in the past only. Consider the deferral machine that is a script. The authenticity of theater is always off of the script and into the queasy and always variable future of its never completed life in production. But isn't that the same, at least to some degree, for other arts? Looking at the Venus von Willendorf, paleoarchaeologists have said what seems obvious: the object was made to be in hand. Hand or object in hand or hand on object is less, which came first, right, is less decidable than the performative interinanimation of the tool and hand as component parts of an assemblage bigger than either of them. And of course, where it is housed today in Austria, the Venus von Willendorf is in a sort of quasi temple, a sort of medieval church mansion visitation room or something in the Natural History Museum in Vienna. And ironically, of course, the hand is removed in the interest of preservation. The object is kept in this temple in a museum. But we could ask whether it is then preservation that takes place, or if this non-handedness, this robbing of the interstice among performances is therefore not preserving the object itself. Might it just as well be buried or put in a closed trunk? We can certainly ask what is being performed by the assemblage that is the Venus von Willendorf display. But to acknowledge that an object's very objecthood is punctuated by the intervals between and among its reappearances and between and among itself and the bodies it hails as co-participants is to acknowledge changeability at a core, not only of performance, but of objecthood. So here I am reminded of Chief Robert Joseph's discussion of the more than human masks of the Kwaku Nation of the Pacific Northwest. Chief Joseph is eloquent about the downtime of the wood and paint masks, which are acknowledged as having, quote, a life of their own, end quote. The masks indeed dance the people, rather than the common settler colonial assumption that it is humans who make the masks dance. No, the mask dances the humans. When they are not dancing the people, the masks are kept guarded and also hidden away. These are objects whose power moves in and out of performance-based engagements with the human beings who preserve the masks along with preserving the traditions of their animacy. In this, the humans too are preserved by the preservation of the masks. Many questions arise when thinking with this kind of performance-based object, and again, perhaps all objects are performance-based. I suppose we could agree here that all objects, like gestures in human constellations, have histories and traditions of use, despite the fact that some objects and gestures, due to violence such as colonial plunder, have been robbed of those traditions and appropriated into other ritual traditions under the triumphal arch, as it were, preserving them according to rituals of commodified Western art, say, rather than rituals of potlatch, etc. We are likely more comfortable acknowledging the human history of an object's use than we are acknowledging the co-participation or the actancy of the object or thing in agentic interaction with humans. We, meaning Euro-Enlightenment tradition, usually assume that it is the humans who are responsible for the actions and conditions of objects, and not the objects themselves, or better, not the assemblage, that is, objects and persons. In the Kwaku ritual of potlatch, There are demands made by the object itself upon the other actants who engage with it. And as Chief Joseph relates, even while hidden, when not on display, an object can wield an incredible power. I am speaking of more than simply honoring an object as the object demands. I am suggesting in addition that what is preserved is always a ritual assemblage. Or not preserved, right? I'm not sure that these masks are appropriately necessarily preserved when in particular contexts. I am suggesting in addition that what is preserved is always a ritual assemblage. I am saying that part of what constitutes the object itself is its fleshly relations, and the constellation of those relations is co-determined by the ritual object and the ritual participants that engage it, whether in a museum, a gallery, a temple, or a Kwaku big house. We are made by our objects just as we make our objects, or said another way, we make our objects, we are our objects, and simultaneously the objects we make us. So Hannah Holing said, bringing it back to the question that I keep avoiding, but in conservation, is it sufficient to simply say performance remains? She also said, does conservation of agential objects mean allowing them to fully dictate their conditions of care? Would conservation shift entirely into a performative paradigm, leaving aside the dead matter of fixity and authenticity? And I said, I am not saying that conservation should shift entirely to a performative paradigm. I think what I'm saying is actually that conservation is and has already been that. I am saying that conservation has always already, even in its more traditional or imperial instances, been a performance-based practice for the preservation of performance. It already operates vis-a-vis a performative paradigm. It is preservation of performance and already it is performative in that it brings into being something that it, as a practice, determines to be preservation. So Hannah then said, if conservation is already practice-based, what would happen to performance art conservation? That is, to the question of conserving performance art, if we shift slightly to see conservation as already having been preserving performance, but only preserving particular rituals that manifest particular cultural object remains. And I said, well, maybe nothing will change. But I said, a museum is, after all, a gallery is, after all, a theater, a dancing ground. It is a house full of repertoires, rules and regulations choreographing the live approach to this or that object, this or that score, this or that enfleshed enactment. There are live bodies performing in the archive all the time. And here we can again think about the Venus Willendorf again, right? Which was made as an object made to be nomadic and to travel by means of hands. Would not a human hand be a component part then of the object made to move? And when thinking about the Venus Willendorf in that little mansion, how is the dance of the object preserved? Or is it not preserved, right? To talk in the language of dance or other time-based behaviors is not actually so odd, for all conservators in art practices are trained in behavior, how wood behaves, right? How metals behave, or in the case of Chief Robert Joseph, how powerful masks behave. So Hannah said, I love the idea of a human hand being a component part of the object dance, but then she came to the point again, but in conservation, is it sufficient to say performance remains? Hannah was pushing me. Is it enough to say conservation practices are already performance-based and performance remains? Because I'm not saying anything helpful or practical. So at the end of the day, I guess I think she is right. It is not sufficient to say this. this talking on and on about bodies jumping, about theater, about ritual, this suggesting that we preserve the interstice, the downtime as part of the liveness of performance is not sufficient. But sufficiency, perhaps, must always be deferred if we are talking about the forever unfinished. So still, she wouldn't let it rest. I had to acknowledge that perhaps I wasn't saying anything helpful, because she said again, but how? How is repetition conservation? I didn't say it then, but perhaps I can say it now. And first of all, repetition, maybe let's ditch that word. And you know, there's some scholars, Soyika Diggs Colbert and Douglas Johnson and Shane Vogel, who have written a book on after repetition that challenges the limits of thinking with repetition. So let's ditch that word and use maybe restoration or attention to againness or care through embodiment or flesh jump. The question is, how is attention to living fleshly fungibility conservation? It probably, I guess what I'm coming to is it probably isn't conversation. I'm sorry, it probably isn't conservation. It probably is performance. Basically, I just think that I like the question better of how is conservation performance? And my hands are somewhat empty relative to other articulations. But therefore, at the end, then Hannah and I agreed to dissensus. We closed by leaving we closed the best of friends, leaving open the possibility for disagreement and for not yet knowing. Thank you very much.
We have also time if you would like to add some more notes regarding your presentation, please.
Okay. Well, how much more time do we have?
10 minutes.
Okay. Well, think about any questions you might have. And I do, you know, there was something obviously cheeky maybe about what I was doing, if you know that idiomatic English phrase, to be cheeky. I was obviously trying to perform something while I was trying to get away from and out from under the question of how for conservation performance remains, and ended up thinking actually more about object remains. And I think to think in these different registers of time, in other words, that objects and performance remain in different time registers. So geologic time for some objects, you know, paint time, wood time, flesh time. And I was brought to some of these questions actually when I had gone to, and I've written about this, some of the Paleolithic sites, some of the caves in France. I'd like to go to some of them in Spain, which house the Paleolithic artwork, particularly the hands gestures that are painted with the negatives, you know, painted by spitting paint onto the hand and leaving the negative space. And I was thinking about what happens if I think about these hand gestures as 40,000-year-old live art, that these are hailings, that these hand gestures are performance-based interactions with a participant who arrives 40,000 years later, and thinking about undoing that the sort of legislation of the limit on time to the question of liveness, which opened for me a lot of different areas and avenues, and maybe, you know, muddied some of the water regarding what we understand or how we understand performance to extend. But it really did bring up the question of gesture for me in a way that I'm still thinking with and still curious about. So I don't know if there are any questions yet. But I can go on and kind of, there was something I was going to say about that. Well, I did then move from that to wanting to think about artwork such as, and I can show some images if we go back, I'll share my screen again, to the question of whether, because at the end of the screen, the end of these images. Oh, here, by the way, I'm glad that we stopped. And here's a thank you very much to Hannah for wherever she catches this, for allowing me to elaborate on our performance experiment. I hope that she doesn't mind. And also here, you can freeze the screen if you're watching this as a recording, and take down some texts that I on the human object binary historically is thought through in terms of Black feminist thought. But I'll go on as well to some images. So let me start with this one. I came across this artist, Emilio Rojas's piece called Instructions for Becoming. And in thinking about this piece and talking with Emilio, he was thinking about call and response of artworks. And he was thinking about his piece as, because it's engaged in call and response, he was calling and responding with a number of artists, one of them being, of course, Laura Aguilar, here seen in some of Aguilar's nature artwork, nature photography, in which there's a sort of an inter-in animation. If you think of the word inter-in animation, it means both becoming animate and becoming inanimate together, inter-in animation of rock and flesh. And all of that in a kind of hailing that includes a hail or a mimetic call between rock and flesh, but also a hail to a viewer in terms of the materiality of the photograph. And I found it very interesting that Rojas was considering his artwork in relationship to as a kind of preservation or a kind of conservation of the performance-based photography of Laura Aguilar and others. He also makes an explicit call out to Gloria Anzaldúa and This Bridge Called My Back in other works that I could go on and show, but he makes performance art response as a preservation to performance art call. And this is the antiphonic aspect of thinking about preservation as preserving the interstice in which a call by a performance work becomes a response from another. So that is kind of maybe it's good to give this concrete example of how some of that is working, right, with antiphony, with call and response as a means for preservation. Now, Laura Aguilar is no longer with us to, sadly, to speak about that reverberation as, what she would think about that as conserving her artwork. But I think the interstice, and Hortense Spillers has written about the interstice in some really important ways that should actually combine with what I'm trying to put forward here.
Many thanks, Rebecca. There is one comment in the chat. They are asking regarding the list of references.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was really inspiring to think about conversation processes as lateral dialogues. You also mentioned about some works about repetition. May you share some of them, please? Yes. There is a book by us. Okay, let me put it in the chat. Let me find the actual link and put a link in the chat. It's Soyika Diggs Colbert and Shane Vogel and Doug Johnson. I'm looking for it now. Here it is. I'm sorry to send Amazon.com to you all, but that is what you're going to be receiving in the chat. You mentioned you will share a list of references. I did. So when there are other references too. If you're really interested in, please send me an email. I'll send you the full bibliography. And you can find me at Rebecca_Schneider@brown.edu. The concept of conservation of performance is very inspiring. Hannah is absent in the talk, but we could feel her existence. Fantastic. Objects are static, but with narrative, it becomes performative. But to be sufficient, what is the most important element for performance? That's a really great question. Objects are static. I think I'm trying to say that objects are not static. I'm trying to say that objects are in fact moving maybe in geologic time or in wood time. I mean, there's movement always, there's decay, and in different times, in different time scales that we, and there's, you know, there's algorithmic time, there's human labor time, there's mountain time, and objects are moving in time, and they are moving, I think, relationally. And I think that the human, you know, I think I mentioned the paleoarchaeologist Leroy Gorin, who writes really, again, about the Paleolithic, but we could also think about it with media studies, right? About that the hand and the tool are not decidable as distinct. That a hand burns, many people have written about this, but that the assemblage that is hand and tool, without the tool, there isn't the hand. Without the hand, there isn't a tool. But which came first is not decidable. I mean, some argue that, well, the tool comes first or the human comes first. But I think that our inanimation in the world, in a reverberant living world where livingness jumps. Now, here's another book that I really recommend by Mel Chen called Animacies. And it's really about taking apart the white liberal humanist Enlightenment animacy hierarchy that puts the human on top, right? And all the white male human on top, and all other sort of lesser object beings below, leaving stone as the most non-live. But what happens if we think with a kind of ecosoma livingness, and not to steal from, not to appropriate indigenous knowledges, but to try to acknowledge that this is an ongoing way of thinking in many indigenous cultural contexts that have been violently forgotten through capital colonialism. What is it to try to learn humbly through indigenous wisdoms about the interanimate, the interanimate livingness of the world, and what role does performance play with that? And this is the way in which thinking with performance conservation is also, I think, really thinking about a complete reorientation out from under the triumphal arch, moving sideways, about moving laterally to besideness, to withness, you know, are ways of thinking about otherwise worlds than the racial capitalocene, than the Anthropocene. So that's still a lot of words that I've put in a word salad for you all, but maybe it helps. And I went on and on about that question, so thank you for it. I did say the most important element for performance. I will not come up with that. I cannot. I did suggest maybe it's the interstice. I did suggest that maybe it's the spaces between performances. The thing we don't try to, that's what we need to preserve, that the conditions for performance are the interstices between the performances. And so what is that, right? So when Chief Robert Joseph talks about, and I should send you all, if you want that, that text, it's in, I think it's in a book about masks, and I can send that to you. Oh, I do have it. Well, anyway, I think we might be out of time, but I will say that Robert Joseph speaks about the power, the violent power of masks. Okay, I'm going to stop. We're out of time, but thank you. Those are great questions. If you want the bibliography, please email me.